All right, y'all, here we go. I am going to attempt to record the first part of chapter 5, um, entitled Infancy, Let the Language Achievements Begin. This is from your book, Language Development from Theory to Practice by Khara Turnbull and Laura Justice. This is the third edition. One of the things that I really love about infancy, and one of the reasons why it is one of my favorite groups of humans to work with, is that I feel like the amount of development that takes place during infancy is the most magical and incredible part of our lifespan. I really feel like infancy and development in general is the closest we get in a secular world to magic and miracles. So let's start talking about infancy and about speech language development during infancy. All right, here we go. Of course. All right, so in order for us to develop spoken language and to develop language in general, we need a mode of perception. So for the vast majority of us, speech perception is our way in. So one of the really amazing things is that our auditory development is actually online before we ever get out into the world. So even by 18 weeks gestation, a fetus is developing ears, and the middle and inner ear structures are developed as well. By 24, 25 weeks gestation, fetuses actually have an intact hearing mechanism and an intact and functioning hearing mechanism, and it's actually the same size it will be your entire life. There are studies that have actually shown that a fetus will react by movement uh, to their mother's voice by 23 weeks gestation. So that's pretty amazing. So one of the things you need to remember about that, though, is that speech perception is not just what we start when we come into the world. It is something that before we're ever done cooking, we're already starting to create neural pathways. So we come into the world essentially primed for attuning to speech sound and speech characteristics beyond just environmental noises. So our speech perception skills continue to develop exponentially during your first year of life, during infancy. All right, so in terms of milestones, one of the things that we need to think about too, as we're thinking about speech perception, is we focus on the prosodic characteristics of speech. So that's kind of, I think of prosody and intonation, which is the third bullet, as essentially the music of speech. So it's the frequency of sounds, or the frequency, like fundamental frequency, how high, how low is the sound, how long does the sound last, and how loud is it? That's an intensity. So one of the things that we talk about, and one of the things that infants attune to, are stress patterns as well. So here in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, just remember, stress isn't just what we feel. It is also where we put the emphasis on things, which is also kind of why we get stressed. Okay, so intonation, like I said, is similar to stress, but it's more looking at, so if you think of stress when it comes to speech as where the emphasis is being placed in a word, intonation is actually where the emphasis and the prosodic cues are being placed in the actual utterance, in the phrase, etc. So, um, one of the things, like, so in what we're seeing here, uh, the difference between really and really is a intonation. So really is a rising intonation, and really is more of a flat intonation. So one of the things we're looking at is, so how do you know that it's an interrogative or a question? It's because of prosodic characteristics and intonation. So by 9 months, infants are actually, and because we are in general monolingual, ethnocentric Americans, I'm going to be talking from that point of view and perspective, and we're going to talk about infants learning primarily English. So one thing that we know is that by 9 months, infants learning English actually prefer words that have strong, weak stress patterns. So it helps them figure out which part of the word they're supposed to be paying attention to. So, and it also, every language has its structure for where stress patterns are in individual words. So it helps them figure out where a word is when you're looking at continuous speech. So for, in this example, the first one, the blue is the stressed part. So photograph. Yep, I'm on top of it. Photograph. So photograph. And the second one, you have photographer. So photographer. And you can see, so the tall boxes versus the low boxes, that shows you also in the shape of the word where the stress pattern is. So if you go photographic, you are putting the stress on the graph. So in the joy that is English words, it shows you that by changing really where the stress pattern is in the word, it completely changes the semantics of the word or the meaning of the word. And that's a really important thing. All right. So one of the other things that infants attune to are the phonetic details of speech, including the phonemes and the combinations of phonemes. So one of the things that you will learn in your articulation and phonology course in phonetics is a concept called phonotactic constraint. And what that means is that infants and whatever, as we're learning languages, we learn what the acceptable combinations of sounds are in that particular language. So for instance, in English, the zh sound doesn't appear at the beginning or in the at the beginning of words. So it does occur in the initial and final part of words. So we may have a word like beige where it's in the final position, or a word like vision where it's in the medial position, but it is not in the initial position. Whereas in French, at least as far as I understand it, the je sound can be in the initial position and medial and final, and actually occurs with a great deal more frequency than it does in English. So one of the things that contributes to our ability to learn phonotactic constraints and to pay attention to what sounds are allowed to be combined and what aren't in the language that we're learning is a concept called categorical perception. So I'm going to try to switch which screen I'm sharing. And it looks like I have been sharing screen 2 all along, so wonderful. So here we go.
experience of perception variances in sensory phenomena that can be varied along a continuum. Multiple views of a face, for example, are mapped onto a common identity. Visually distinct objects such as cars are mapped into the same category and variable speech sounds are perceived as discrete phonemes. Within a particular part of the continuum, the percepts are perceived as the same, with a sharp change of perception at the position of the continuum where there is identity change. Categorical perception is opposed to continuous perception. The perception of different sensory phenomena as being located on a smooth continuum. How the neural systems in the brain engages in nothing is major issue in modern neuroscience. Categorical perception, CP, can be inborn or can be induced by learning. Initially it was taken to be peculiar to speech and color perception. However, CP turns out to general, and related to how neural networks in our brains detect the features that allow us to sort the things in the world into separate categories by warping perceived similarities and differences, so that they compress some things into the same category and separate others into different ones. An area in the left prefrontal cortex has been localized as a place in the brain responsible for phonetic, and possibly other types of categorical perception.
All right. Now, theoretically, I'm going to switch you back to the slides, or maybe for the first time ever, I'm going to switch you to the slides. So here we are. Um, Let me check, make sure. Okay, we should be on screen 3. Let's see what we're doing. All right, so that is I put the link for that particular YouTube video at the bottom of this slide in case you want to try it again. All right, so moving right along, the next thing we're going to talk about, oh, hey, it's going to try to play, and it did. This is my third take on this particular lecture or whatever recording, because the last time I tried it, it did not work, and it crashed my whole system, and it was really just not good. All right, so here we go again. So one of the other things that happens in the first year of life in terms of milestones is that we come into the world wired to be able to perceive all of the different phonemes and stress patterns of any language that is produced anywhere in the world. But as time goes on, we do what is called perceptual narrowing. So we start to really hone in just on those phonemes that we are hearing in our environment on a regular basis. So if you are a monolingual English language learner, you really just focus on the phonemes of English. So even if, let's say, you are in the grocery store, or I don't know, taking a walk, and you hear folks speaking in Spanish or Tagalog or whatever, the infant is not going to tune in to the phonemes being produced because they're not the ones that they typically hear. So that's called perceptual narrowing. So one of the reasons it becomes more difficult for us to learn languages as adult learners, or as even late as late elementary into middle school, is because we've really narrowed our perceptual skills and our motor skills, and we've honed our motor skills to really focus on the phonemes that are part of the language, our primary language. So even if so if you're bilingual, the same thing happens, it just happens a little bit differently. Bilingual or multilingual, you'll still perceptually narrow down to the languages that you're hearing regularly, so you won't have as narrow of perceptual capabilities as a monolingual speaker, but you will still only you'll focus down to the languages being spoken around you and in your home and to you. So the phonotactic regularities, I already talked about phonotactic constraints. So that is the same idea, is being able to tell the difference between sounds, and being able to recognize which are acceptable sound combinations. And that's one of the ways too that infants start to be able to tell junctures between words. A lot of it has to do with timing, but it also has to do with understanding phonotectic regularities. Okay, so we watched the YouTube video on categorical, on category formation. So we're going to stay with that concept, and we try to categorize input in the ways that highlight meaning. So going back to the previous slide, what it's showing you is the visual difference between ba versus va, and then it's showing you on a spectrogram the difference between ba versus va. And so what we're looking for here, and so you can see that because of the continuant aspect of va, you have noise that occurs or frequency that occurs here, where in the production of ba, you don't. So it's really pretty amazing how subtle the differences are, and yet how our brains manage to figure out what they are, that these are distinctly different sounds that create distinctly different words and contribute to meaning in very different ways. All right, so that's the idea of categorical speech, as we start to put sounds into different frames, so that we can say, okay, the difference between ba and va is that va is it looks different when somebody says it if you're looking at them, and it sounds different because v is a continuant sound. So one of the categories that our brains kind of smushes different phonemes into is continuant versus non-continuant sounds. So the stop sounds like p and b and k and g and t and d are put in a different category than, say, the fricative sounds. All right, so the idea of allophones is that you can a sound can be slightly different and still be the same sound. So one of the things that I encourage you to do is listen to my dogs bark. One moment, please. All right, let's try this again. Okay, so the variation in sounds in the same category are called allophones. So for instance, if you sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm, or Camptown Races, doo-dah, that's an even better one. So the difference between do, the d and do, and the d and da is because of the co-articulation of the vowel that follows. So have a good time singing to yourself and feeling the slight difference in placement in do versus da. And you'll see that that's what allophonic variation is. It is the slight differences in the way we produce it, or you can think of it too as the differences in dialects. So if you are a native English speaker and you hear someone speaking Australian English, and you hear someone speaking Londoner English, and you hear a Southern American speaking English, you will still recognize all of those sounds because they are allophones. And you will recognize the words because even though there's allophonic variation, it doesn't change the meaning of the word. All right, so one of the things that we focus on as we are putting sounds into categories is what's called voice onset time. So, for example, the one in the picture, oh my gosh, I'm gonna pause again while the dog barks. One moment, please. Theoretically. All right, here we go again. All right, so the example, what we're looking at is ka, the production of ka. So you can see that the stop releases the k, and then there is an interval of time before we start to produce the ah sound. So essentially, see how this is the diacritic here? That tells you that we are still releasing a little bit of air just prior to the onset of voicing. So ka, right? It's not k, ah, it's ka. So there you go. So that shows you voice onset time. That's one of the things that perceptually we attune to as we are categorizing our sounds. All right, so by 4 months, infants can actually distinguish between purposeful and accidental actions. And this is a really important skill because in order for communication to be meaningful, you have to kind of get that these sounds that I am making with my face, actually, if I put them together in specific ways, will manipulate the other humans in my environment. So the ability, and this is called means end. If I do this, then that happens. So the concept of means end is a super important developmental skill that infants need in order to be able to really move forward with language development. So the idea is that they learn to view actions as goal directed. And once they get that, they start to use what's called intentional communication. And in the beginning, because when we come into the world, we have proportionately heads the size of melons stuck on a toothpick, and we have the motor control of a sack of potatoes. So as we gain more motor control, we can engage in different kinds of movement. So by 4 months, most infants can sit up assisted, or or even some, depending, can sit up unassisted, but they're not quite got the motor control, the gross or fine motor control, to be able to push themselves into a seated position, generally speaking. So one of the things, though, that becomes an important part of routines is that somewhere in the next couple of months, we are going to get enough fine motor control to be able to negotiate having something other than a liquid introduced to the front of our faces, and we will have the motor control and tongue movement to push it back and swallow it successfully. So one of the things that, one of the sites that I found that I thought had really great information is the CDC website. And so I'm going to switch screens and we're going to look at that. Um, so that's the link in your in that on that slide, and it is just a great website. So we're going to click over to the 4 months. just as an example, I'm not going to do this for all of them. So obviously with streaming and recording and everything else, my internet connection is gloriously slow. Okay, but I did want to show you, because this is just such a great resource for you as potential speech language pathologists, to share with your with families you're working with, or you as someday a parent or an aunt or an uncle or the friend of somebody with small people. They're really great. Like, one of the things I like is that if you click on like the camera, it shows you um, a spontaneous smile by this precious little peanut here. And one of the other things that I really like is if we go here, we get milestones, the language communication milestones, like babbling. So how great is that? Okay, so other things that so this is more babbling. See, in there you actually can hear two different vowels. So in the first one, you can hear them too. So the oh, that is you have a nice uh, and that's a really good example of vocal play. Uh, so this is a good one too. See, and that's responding to affection, which is just really neat. So anyway, I really, 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 really recommend that you play with this website. It has great developmental check sheets. It has really good examples. Another thing I would really recommend you do is, as you're working your way through this material, go to YouTube and put in things like babies babbling or categorical development or any concept that really is kind of muddy for you, because there are awesome YouTube videos and examples. And you guys know what kind of learners you are or what really sticks with you best. So I recommend, this is a great opportunity for you to really engage with that. All right, moving on. So, but between 3 to 9 months, we're still working on our categories, and we're starting to be able to predict things. So one of the things that that researchers have found is that an infant's ability to form categories actually is a sign of later cognitive and language abilities at 2 and cognitive outcomes at age 2.5. All right, so one of the things that you need to be really mindful of as you think of cognitive outcomes is, in the very early years, we measure cognition primarily through language means. So it's not surprised that they're correlated, because we're actually measuring essentially the same things. So take that as you will. All right, so category formation. Your book actually has a really great figure on page 128 at the bottom that shows the difference between superordinate, basic, and subordinate levels of categorization as babies learn words. And remember, this is all happening long before we actually start producing meaningful words. Now, one of the things that we know is that infants who are introduced to sign, whether they are deaf or hard of hearing or have or not, uh, that they will start to sign earlier than they will use spoken words. And one of the reasons for that is that signing is more of a gross motor activity, and speech is the finest of fine motor activities. So if you think back to our example of va versus ba, the difference in terms of how far your articulators have to move is pretty infinitesimal compared to how far your hands move for a gesture like pointing or like signing. So gross motor skills tend to develop first, and as our neurology and our neuroanatomy and our connections improve, then our fine motor skills kind of come along behind them. And speech, like I said, is the finest of the fine motor skills. So there you go. So one of the reasons we know that infants as young as 3 to 9 months can distinguish between superordinate, basic, and subordinate levels of categories is um, because of the really excellent research that we're going to talk about in part 4 of this series. Okay, so at the superordinate level, we're talking about it's the broadest category, so animal. So at the basic level, perhaps the animal is a dog, which is really appropriate for my household since I have 4. And the subordinate level is a more specific breed, and you could even get more subordinate than that and get down to the specific name of the specific dog. So for example, in my house I have my animals, and they are dogs, and one of them is a Chiweenie, and then at the subordinate to that, her name is Thea. So there you go. All right, so perceptual categories. So one of the ways that we go about forming categories during infancy is we start with what are called perceptual categories. And those kinds of categories are based on color, shape, texture, size, and things like that. So one of the things that we know, so for instance, a really confusing um, difference between in terms of categorization perceptually is if you had an orange ball and the fruit an orange. So color wise, they are roughly the same. Shape wise, they're roughly the same. Now, texture wise, chances are the ball is smoother than the orange, and that may be where the infant starts to be able to make out the difference between an orange and the ball. And then size, if the ball is much bigger than the orange or vice versa, then that is a way that the distinction can be made between the two. So one of the really interesting things is that by 3 months old, infants can distinguish the difference between a dog and a cat, which is kind of fun. By 4 months old, they can distinguish between animals and furniture. So you may be thinking like, wow, that's impressive. But so the way I think about it is, okay, so let's go back to our dog example. So the dog is an animal. It has 4 legs. A table as furniture, it also has 4 legs. So at some point, they start to be able to tell the difference between animate and inanimate objects, and can tell the difference between animals and furniture. Okay. Now, as they improve and as their categories get more refined, they move into what is called conceptual categories. And conceptual categories require the infant to know what an object does. So a ball rolls, a dog barks, airplanes fly, cats meow, um, tables don't do that. There you go. So that's conceptual categorization versus perceptual categorization. All right, so now by 5 months old, remember we talked about the development of means end, that infants realize that human behavior is goal directed. If I do this, then this happens. By 5 months old, infants have started to realize that the sounds they are making with their faces can start to manipulate their environment when they make. So in the video that we watched from the CDC website, the baby who makes the high pitched sounds and his caregiver uh, responds back, what that infant is learning is that when I make these cute little sounds, this other person who takes care of me responds, kisses my cheek, talks back to me, picks me up, any number of things. So one of the things that, and you don't have to know this for assessment purposes, but as potential speech language pathologists, this is a really, really great way to think about vocalizations and early vocal development. So, and we're going to talk about some of these. Actually, we're going to go over the broad categories that are grouped. We're going to talk about the five developmental levels that are detailed by the Stark assessment of early vocal development. So in my head, I like to think that this was developed by Tony Stark, which of course it wasn't. But I think it's kind of a fun idea that maybe something that we use in speech language development was developed by an Avenger. Whatever, maybe you don't think that's interesting. Eh. All right, so here we go. So the first of the five developmental categories are reflexive sounds. So these are the sounds that just everybody makes, the grunts and burps and lips smacking that infants engage in just at random, just as part of being a functioning organism. The thing about it, and crying, the thing about it is that we respond, adults respond, as if these reflexes are actually communication attempts. So, for instance, if a baby sneezes, if it is common in your household to say "bless you," then the caregiver is going to respond with that. So, baby sneezes, the caregiver turns, makes eye contact, looks at the baby, and says, "Bless you." Or I think one thing I used to say to my kids when they were newborns, you would be, if you've never held and burped a newborn, you will be very impressed at the volume and duration of an infant burp. My twins used to just puke on me when they burped too. So that was less endearing. But my oldest child, when she burped, like she could rip them, like let's say a 300-pound person who just chugged a beer. Really impressive stuff. So I would respond to that reflexive behavior with a really profound statement like, "Wow, that was a really big burp for a tiny baby." So there you go. Adults respond as if the reflexes are actual communication, and that starts the process of establishing means end. All right, so the second developmental level is control of phonation. And this starts between 1 and 4 months old. So, really, really early on. So, the baby that we saw in the CDC video is roughly 4 months old. And you can hear the approximation of adult vowel like sounds. Um, and then you start to get some isolated consonant sounds in raspberry. So one of the reasons why part of this stage is called cooing and gooing is because infants tend to make the back sounds like k and g. So one of the reasons they make back sounds is that, again, when you are a melon-headed, toothpick-necked sack of potatoes individual flailing around on your little playmat, your tongue, which you don't have great control over, is going to be by gravity um, toward the back. So you're going to make more k and g sounds. So if you're really bored with this lecture, or you're just really bored because you're stuck inside with COVID-19, lay down on the floor and just gurgle some and see what kinds of sounds you make. I can almost promise you it's going to be a lot of k and g, because that's what your tongue is going to do, because it's just going to wobble back to the back and voila. All right. So moving on, the third stage is what's called expansion. And what you may have noticed is that these stages overlap. So if reflexive is 1 to 2 months, and control of phonation is 1 to 4 months, and then or 0 to 2 months for reflexive. And then now we're talking about expansion, which is 3 to 8 months, which overlaps with. The point here is that infants don't get a memo that at 4 months, they are now completely done with this particular stage and they will move on to the next one. So, and infants develop at different rates. So we have a range. Some infants will start with expansion as early as 3 months, and some will really kind of meander into it and achieve mastery sometime around 8 months. And that's why there's a range, and a 5 month range in infancy is really relatively a long time. But there it is. All right. So in the expansion phase, infants are actually producing isolated vowel sounds and vowel glides, like the baby that we watched on the CDC website. And that baby on the CDC website also was a really good example of playing with loudness and pitch. You could hear the pitch rises and the varying intensity, and squealing. It's part of gaining control over your oral mechanism and really playing with phonation and all of the skills that you need in order to build the neural pathways for motor coordination that are required for the speed with which speech moves. Okay, so they may also engage in what is called marginalized babbling, which has some consonant-like and vowel-like sounds, but it has kind of long transitions between the consonant and vowel sounds. So the baby we watched really was using only vowel sounds. So you got a lot of e and ooh. But maybe at some point the baby would have busted out a k or g, but you wouldn't hear coo, the baby necessarily say coo, but they might do g, k, g, k, k. Ooh, there you go. You're welcome. I know that was just inspirational. All right, so the next phase, phase 4, is, or developmental stage, is basic canonical syllables. So now you're starting to get consonant vowel syllables like ba 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 ba. And infants can produce more than two consonant vowel syllables in a sequence, like ba, ba, ba. So reduplicated babbling is when infants are repeating or reduplicating consonant vowel pairs. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen the YouTube video of the super cute little twins standing in front of their refrigerator. One has a sock on, has only one sock on. I think the other one is barefooted, and it sounds like they are having a complete conversation. They laugh at each other, they gesture, but their babbling pattern is really reduplicated babbling. They are really doing a lot of duh vowel combinations. Non-reduplicated babbling is when infants start to actually do different kinds of consonant vowel patterns together. So you might get a ba da ga ga da ba da, something like that, rather than just the da 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 da. You're welcome. Here we go. All right, so the fifth developmental stage is when infants and then now moving into toddlerhood start to actually produce consonant vowel combinations, but with isolated consonants as well. And they're starting to do disyllabic words. They're starting to do produce some of the diphthong sounds like ow. Um, they can do vowel, consonant, vowel sorts of sounds, and that moves them into, and they're playing with, remember how we talked about that they play with pitch rise and differences in intensity and things like that. Um, those are, uh, sorry, we did not move into this. I'm still talking about basic canonical syllables. My bad. Sorry. Remember how we talked about in the expansion stage, infants will experiment with loudness and pitch and may squeal. As they get better and better and they are at playing with the differences in intensity, in the basic canonical syllables, they will start with actually whispered vocalizations. So it's just, again, advancing on the things they've already mastered with variations in pitch and intensity. All right. Infants who are deaf and infants who hear but will and are being taught sign language will actually babble with their hands, which is just a really cool thing to witness. And it shows how wired we are for communication regardless of mode. And that's why it's so important as speech language pathologists and to understand what the developmental phases are and to understand how crucial we are in making sure that we provide communication possibilities to all of our clients. It is, in my opinion, communicating with your environment is one of the things that truly shapes us as humans and our human experience. All right, so the final phase of or stage of early vocalizations is called advanced forms. And this is where you start producing diphthongs and the more complex syllables and even getting all the way to jargon, which sounds a lot like conversation. It just doesn't necessarily have distinguishable words. And sometimes it even does. One of the things that you have to remember, though, as you're thinking about milestones is, remember I talked about there's a lot of overlap between each of these stages. Milestones are not just a direct swoop up from one thing to the next thing to the next. Think about it when you are learning anything. You have this period of emergence. I always think about a long time ago, we were it was when my sister and I were in our 20s. We were at our parents' house in Roanoke, and they had a dartboard in the garage, and we would make teams and play darts in the evening. Well, the first evening we played, my sister, and we don't play darts regularly, so we're really not very good, but my sister was on fire, so we're going to call that emergence. And so she was, there may have been some fermented beverage involved, and so she was talking trash about how she is the natural. And so we spent the evening calling her the natural because she had some serious emergence of dart skills. She was hitting everything. So the next night when we played, though, she was in that period between emergence and mastery where you actually are trying and practicing this particular skill, and she was awful. And so the way to think about this is that there's always this plateau essentially between emergence and mastery. So our skills, our milestones are incremental in development. They are not just a linear upward trend. All right, that's it for this set of slides. Don't do anything you couldn't tell your grandma about, and I will see you in, well, I won't see you. You will hear me in parts 2, 3, and 4. Later, Gators.